If you're part of a Scrum team, chances are you've heard of another Agile approach called Kanban. I'm Emily from Parable, and I'm going to walk you through the 5 fundamental differences between Kanban and Scrum so you can decide which one is best for your team. But first, here's an overview of Kanban and Scrum. What are Kanban and Scrum? Kanban and Scrum are both Agile approaches that helps teams manage their work and projects. Kanban's fundamental principle is to create a steady flow of work through a system. It does this by enabling focus, continuous improvement, and removal of bottlenecks. The Kanban approach originated with Toyota in 1940. It was originally a framework for optimizing the process of manufacturing cars, but now it has much more broader applications. In modern lingo, the process of Kanban often gets confused with the process's main artifact, which is the Kanban board. Kanban boards were popularized by Trello. You might have heard of them. Teams from around the world, from manufacturing to software development, now use boards with columns that visualize their workflow. In its most basic implementation, a Kanban board contains 3 columns: backlog, work in progress or WIP, and done. In Kanban, cards representing deliverables move through a Kanban board's columns as their status changes. What is Scrum? Scrum is by far the most commonly used Agile framework, with recent data indicating that 66% of Agile teams practice it. With Scrum, teams work in cycles called sprints. The goal of each sprint is to work at a sustainable pace to release a small, valuable increment of work, often in the form of a piece of software. Scrum includes specific events geared toward helping teams reflect and adapt to their work. These include sprint retrospectives and sprint reviews, among other events, which helps teams chart their progress and practice continuous improvement. Scrum teams organize their members according to 3 accountabilities: developers who build the product, a product owner who prioritizes the work, and a Scrum Master who helps the teams understand and practice Scrum. What do Kanban and Scrum have in common? Before I get into the differences, here's an overview of the similarities between Kanban and Scrum. Kanban and Scrum both follow Agile principles, like delivering value to customers often, empowering team members, continuous improvement of the work progress, and minimizing waste. Kanban and Scrum aim to keep the team focused by limiting the amount of work assigned to them. Kanban and Scrum teams both use a board to visualize their work. These include columns that represent the status of items in the work process and individual task cards showing what is on the backlog or in progress. Kanban and Scrum both aim to make work items as small as possible. This helps the teams deliver finished, usable product updates to customers often. Kanban and Scrum both focus on maintaining a sustainable pace. Both frameworks value finding and maintaining a sustainable and predictable pace for teams and stakeholders. Now I'm going to talk you through the differences between Kanban and Scrum so you can choose which one is suitable for your team. So 1, Kanban makes work flow. Scrum puts work into cycles. So Kanban emphasizes flow. Flow is like water in a river. Work moves downstream, uninterrupted, continuously. Whereas Scrum organizes work around sprints. Sprinting involves running, but also pausing to reflect on work and prepare for the next sprint. The key difference is that Kanban is continuous, whereas Scrum is iterative. In Kanban, there is no end to the process, just a stream of work items flowing to completion ever more fluidly. In Scrum, there's a clear start and end to each 2 to 4 week sprint cycle, and every sprint should become more efficient based on discoveries from earlier cycles. The most visible manifestation of this difference is the artifact or commitment Kanban and Scrum teams use to guide their work. So in Kanban, the Kanban board represents the continuous process of work and visualizes bottlenecks that break the flow. In Scrum, the sprint goal sets the destination the team is headed to and influences whether a sprint was successful or not. 2. Kanban teams pull work continuously. Scrum teams push toward a fixed goal. Kanban creates focus for the team by setting a work in progress limit. This means that the team only pulls in new items into the process when it has the capacity to do so. Scrum protects the team from too many to-dos with a focused sprint goal and sprint planning. This prevents new work from being added to a team's task list, the sprint backlog, once a sprint has started. So instead, the teams push ahead with the sprint goal with the tasks they have assigned to themselves. So instead of someone pushing tasks onto a team's plates, regardless of capacity, Kanban teams only pull in new work from the backlog when they have completed items already in progress. This approach might sound logical, but most workplaces operate in push systems. For example, one or more managers keep pushing more and more work to a team, regardless of what work is already in progress. In Scrum, the team has the final say in committing to the sprint goal and the items they'll work on during that sprint. Scrum teams plan their tasks ahead of time in the sprint planning and then push to meet the sprint goal. So this can result in stress and overwork in cases where the goal turns out to be too ambitious, but the team doesn't want to abandon the overall objective. Essentially, Scrum teams make a bigger and therefore riskier commitment. They aspire toward an entire sprint goal encompassing multiple work items. A Kanban team only commits itself to one individual work item each time it pulls one into the work in progress column. That's why Kanban is so applicable to repeatable processes like manufacturing. One approach isn't necessarily better than the other. Scrum's sprint goal creates vision and purpose at the risk of task gluttony, whereas Kanban teams may end up surfing a lean and repetitive workflow to nowhere. 3. Kanban and Scrum teams use boards differently. The official Scrum Guide doesn't mandate using a task board, but most Scrum teams do. The 15th State of Agile report found that Kanban practitioners and many Scrum teams use task boards that look similar from afar, but are different when we look closer. So here are the differences between Kanban boards and Scrum boards. One Kanban board may serve multiple teams, but in Scrum there's usually one board per team. The Scrum Board includes a sprint backlog in addition to a standard backlog. Kanban boards have a work in progress limit, either for the entire board, specific columns, or both. Usually, Kanban boards have a more detailed visualization of the team's workflow, with more columns to reflect each process step. This process may be heavily tailored to the stages of creating a product. New items are added to the Scrum Board at the start of every sprint, whereas tasks flow infinitely through a Kanban board. Kanban teams sometimes find their framework dull and repetitive with its ever-looping work process without a clear start or beginning. 4. Kanban teams forecast. Scrum teams estimate. Kanban teams make a probabilistic forecast of when and how much work the teams can complete. That's if they make projections at all. For example, they might use historical data to calculate that there's an 85% chance an individual work item gets completed within 8 days. Scrum also uses historical data, but mixes it with the team's experience to give an estimate, which is more like a mix of judgment and calculation. They'll use regular events like backlog refinement and planning poker to estimate the size of work items by comparing them to each other. Then, They'll check on how much work they got done during the previous sprints, their sprint velocity, and use that number to limit the work they plan for future sprints. 5. Kanban complements existing systems. Scrum replaces them. Since Kanban helps teams optimize their workflow at the level of individual tasks, anyone can use it in their work. It's easily applicable to parts of existing systems, methods, and organizational structures. Whether you're making Toyotas, writing articles, or building software, Kanban can slot in and visualize your workflow. Scrum, on the other hand, prescribes teams roles and recurring events that need to be followed for it to work. It's more of a commitment that often replaces parts of existing systems, methods, and organizational structures. This distinction means it takes more effort for a team to adopt Scrum. This difference between the two approaches doesn't necessarily mean one is easier than the other to implement. Since Scrum is more prescriptive and offers more guidance, it can actually be more manageable for teams new to Agile because they know what the rules are. Here's something to note. Kanban teams do sometimes add specific roles, like a service delivery manager in charge of improving workflow efficiency, akin to a Scrum Master role, or a service request manager in charge of customer satisfaction, similar to a product owner in Scrum. But these roles aren't mandatory, and often these responsibilities can be spread across the entire Kanban team. Kanban or Scrum, which one is right for your team? Whether Kanban or Scrum is suitable for your team depends on your existing experience with Agile frameworks, the type of projects you work on, and your appetite for organizational change. If you're trying to figure out which one is right for you, we've made this Kanban versus Scrum showdown as simple as we can. Choose Scrum when defining a consistent workflow for your tasks is hard, but you can build a cross-functional team to tackle varied types of work. You're just starting with Agile. The Scrum process provides more structure than Kanban and clearly defined roles for your team members. You prefer a well-defined rhythm of sprints with scheduled events for planning, execution, and reflection. Something to note is that following the Scrum sprint cycle also requires customers and stakeholders who are okay with such a rhythm. You work on emergent and complex products. Scrum shines when you want to learn fast and experiment because it gives teams a framework to commit to new experiments and reflect on their learnings. Choose Kanban when you constantly end up with more work than you can complete, especially if that happens because people outside of the team, say managers, keep piling on more work. Alternatively, if you're a Scrum team, try imposing work in progress limits for your team. You want to be more flexible in which work to take on or release without waiting for the next sprint planning or review event. You don't want to or can't change much about existing processes and roles in your team and organization. You work on repetitive and predictable tasks. Kanban shines when your tasks are repetitive because it's easier to spot blockages and optimize your workflow if you know that different parts of production typically take a fixed amount of time. That's your overview of Kanban versus Scrum. I hope this was helpful. Till next time.